Hey, what up, what up? What's going on? What y'all on today? Me, on the other hand, I got something a little different for you. Today, I want to give you a story that majority of us can resonate with, but a story all of us can understand. I'm going to introduce you to a woman who fought her entire life just to live it. How it affected the people and loved ones around her, even the people who wasn't. And in order to do that, I got to take y'all to Cleveland, Ohio. Shout out to my man Solo. This is A Light Lost in Darkness.
So I go extra hard on that hard flow.
Call me D. Now there's a woman by the name of Shaletha Yvette Perry, aka Peaches, which is the name that we're gonna use to refer to her throughout the story. She was raised in the heart of Cleveland, Ohio, and like many inner cities around that time, this city set is one of the most dangerous places to reside in, recording 799 murders the year Peaches was actually born. And that number, it got lower, but it would rise again as the years go on. So as dangerous as Cleveland was at the time, it was twice as rough having to live in an area where a lot of that crime was coming from, overcrowded with nothing but negative reinforcement. So growing up in a place that dark, you'd be surprised at the good and wholesome memories you create. But that's just one POV of it, or many depending on who you ask.
The most recent census information places the city's childhood poverty rate at more than 50%. That is way above the national average.
But in this very rare case, it didn't matter. Because if you have to scratch your way from the bottom, coming from any region or city, there's a very high chance you won't think about the reasons the place you call home is the way it is.
So why is that figure the sobering reality that we Clevelanders face?
It was an event that made it hard to live in the 80s a half a decade ago, the Great Depression of the 1930s. And it was considered a devastating turning point in Cleveland's history. You could argue that no place in America was as lifelong scarred by the Depression than the Midwest region. So when you hear stories from people like Steve Harvey going from homeless to having a radio show, Jesse Owens going against racism and still prevailing during a time where our skin color was merely tolerated and not loved, or growing up in the same generation as LeBron James, one of the greatest to play the game of basketball, all raised in Cleveland, so it was possible to make it out. But when you know the odds, it was hard to ignore.
Love this shit, my cat, you my cat.
Now Peaches grew up a middle child to an older sister and younger brother. Since a little girl, she had a huge personality. Her sense of humor could be overbearing at times, but it was that same humor that everyone adored her for.
I remember one time I was sick. I was about 6 years old. That means she was 3. My mother was giving me a thermometer and everything. She walked up to me, laid her head on me like the loving little sister. "Nikki, are you okay?" And I'm like, "I'm sick." Next thing I know, this little motherfucker and smacked me, knocked the thermometer out my mouth, bust it all on the floor. She run off laughing and playing like it was the funniest thing in the world. But that's just the type of person she was.
Super active and playful like any other child, but her life was a far cry from normalcy. So before I tell you where she's going, I gotta tell you where she came from. 2 generations above Peaches lived a woman named Peggy that everyone in the neighborhood called Miss P, which is her mother's mother, her grandmother. And if you didn't know, majority of the black families got that trickle-down effect from the old days, dating back almost a century. Whereas though the older you were, the harder you had it in life. It's almost impossible for the generation of the day to even understand what their elders endured, witnessed, fought for, or even died for without them going through the process themselves. And Miss P, she was just another representation of that history. She would have to bear her very first child through assault. Now you might ask, why not get an abortion? You know, why go through the 9-month term at all? Besides the fact that abortion was illegal up until 1973, there was a lot of folk who still believed in anti-abortion. Now whether Miss P felt this way or not is unknown at the time. She'll go on, have 6 more children, and Peach's mother, who we'll refer to as Rusty throughout the story, would be the second born and oldest girl of her siblings. Their grandmother's assault would change the tide in her life for years, never staying in relationships long enough to build somewhat of a connection. She'll find another man a year after and end up having his baby the next. So all 7 of her children will have different fathers. Now her grandmother could be considered to be promiscuous, your standard teen going through puberty, or a victim acting on her trauma. A survivor can become hypersexual even years after it happened, using that to reassert their control over their life, control over when and who they have sex with. Pursuing a career in psychiatric nursing, home care nurse, nurse's aide, she came from that generation who looked down upon drug use, besides a little weed here and there. But this old school angel definitely indulged in the other side of the game, while also being one of the best crack cooks on the block. Never sold or used it, but could bring back the best batch you lay hands on. She was that cool grandma who ain't played now game about respect inside that household, and this set the course for the family tree that stands till this day.
Next on News Center 8, with Cleveland snow clearing crews crippled by layoffs, we'll have an update on the worst storm of winter.
And there was a storm of protests in Cleveland.
Now, one generation above Peaches, we got Rhonda, aka Rusty. Years would pass, the family would grow. We're kicking off the early 80s with a bang. And that bang was crack cocaine, known as rocks, stones, flavor, hard, whatever nickname your city, region, or hood had for the baked up version of cocaine. And Peach's mother, Rusty, was a young teenager smack dabbed in the middle of this epidemic. Coming up in that specific time among 6 siblings, she had a slight feeling of neglect. Her mother was one woman having to split her attention 7 different ways, which affected Rusty a lot more than the others. She started to dabble into drinking and small amounts of drugs, bud here and there, a drink or two. You could even catch her at a bar at the tender age of 14, mingling amongst grown men. Now, whether people knew is unknown, but you can bet back in those days the rules wasn't enforced as much as they were today. Not long after turning 14, she would be pregnant with her first child, Nikki, giving birth in 1978. 2 years later, she's 16, giving birth to our beloved Peaches. She had her final child, Ron, the year 1984. So whether it was to break a cycle or that last pregnancy being a scare, that would be the last time she goes through the process of pregnancy. And all her children will have a different father, the same as her mother, aside from having 7 kids versus her with just 3 of her own. So breaking into her 20s, Rusty had lived enough life for a fully grown woman with many more years ahead of her. A loving mother, only equipped with what the streets and the generation before her provided her with in order to survive and have a little fun in the process.
My mother was pregnant with me at 14, had me at 15. Technically, she was still a kid. My father was 18. He met her as she was in a bar drinking. When you hanging out with people that's older and your boyfriend is 21 years old, you kind of get caught up doing shit that you normally wouldn't do.
I just did it this morning and about a half hour ago. I smoked about 5 packs like a half hour ago. And I wish I had 2 more.
Our culture was still in the peak of that party lifestyle era, and by this time Rusty was no longer a stranger to the game, upgrading and picking up stronger choices of drugs. Now, a lot of people thought it as another party drug, which it was, but still had an addictive element involved, but nowhere on the level as crack. And like so many others in the black community, Rusty wanted to party as well. But when the music stopped, crack was still busting. Rusty would raise her children in the Carver Park area, East 40th and Quincy, and the Cleveland Metropolitan Housing Authority. Now, there were good days, bad days, and worse days. It's the year 1985. 4-year-old Peaches and her older sister Nikki will wake up in the middle of the night searching for their mother. After realizing their mom was gone, you couldn't describe the amount of fear they were feeling that night. With their bedroom window wide open, they screamed for their mother for hours until they were just too exhausted to scream anymore. Needless to say, that night was traumatizing for them. But it wasn't the last time Mother Rusty would take an overnight vacation. This would happen a few more times over the years, but there was one night specifically, just as the time before. This being a close quarter project, there's no doubt several people heard their cries for help, but nobody came. They started to scream so loud that their grandmother, who stayed behind the apartments in a set of row houses, could actually hear her grandbabies. And it wasn't too long before she came to the rescue. Taking them all back home with her, they stayed until their mother came back. Even though Peaches had experienced this before, it didn't make the fear any different from the first time. And it wouldn't be the last. So as Rusty fell deeper into using, it was her morality that walked her out of that front door every single time, not allowing her children to bear the sight of her addiction.
In my mother's defense, she had me at 15, had my sister at 18, and she was young. You know, I can remember plenty of nights waking up in the middle of the night and my mother gone. I'm 6, 7 years old in the house with my little sister, you know, getting up, yelling out the window, screaming in the projects because my mama ain't there.
But on those good days, like buying 25-cent ices, lining up at the Bill's truck for candy, Peaches and her siblings would go to a recreational center, Lonnie Burton, or what they call POC, swimming pools inside and out, double dutch, hide and seek, kickball inside of the field connected to the rec center. And during one of these days, the Perry kids would learn about an old urban legend going back generations called the Green Lady, that everyone was literally petrified of, depicted as a green-skinned woman who would chase after children when the sun goes down. She was Cleveland's own boogeyman, a story parents told their kids, scaring them into being home before the street lights came on. And like any rumor or story in the hood, it only takes a few kids on the block to have claims of seeing the Green Lady.
Always described as being demented, demonic, deformed, green in hue, naked woman that would chase down children, eat them, kill them, scratch them up, beat them, kidnapping. The list goes on. You always know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody that really got chased by her.
The legend is about Mary Weatherby, who seeks revenge on the children and grandchildren of the local hoods who raped and killed her and her mother Helen Weather. That there would stamp her name in the city for generations to come. No one really knows the origin to this myth, but to Peaches, it was very real. By 1988, her mother would try and straddle the fence with drinking and drugging. While trying to maintain a structured role in Peaches' life, she planned to move them out of the projects to a house on Olivet off 105th Street. Peaches is 7 years old, and one morning, her mother left her and her siblings home alone. Now, of course, they've seen this show before, but it never got old. She usually come back the same day or even that night, but little did they know they wouldn't see their mother for a full 3 days. So with the oldest child being only 10 years old, with no phone, no food, they were hopeless. The only thing in the fridge being ketchup and beer. 3 kids going just a day without food would be starving before the next day. They ate the ketchup and they drank the beer, giving most of the ketchup to their younger brother while the girls drank the beer until their stomachs were full. Being the one who drank the most, Nikki started to feel sick. Peaches right beside her, and little brother Ron also scooted a cup below her face just in case she threw up everywhere. And throughout these 3 days, they would get a knock at the door. Nikki being the oldest, she opens it. It's a stranger, somebody that neither of the Perry kids have seen before. But at this moment, they're starving. They need any help that they can get at the moment. He comes in, he sits down and talks with the kids, asks them if they were hungry, if they needed this, if they needed that. And he said he would go to the Burger King on the corner and bring them back some food. He would leave and never comes back. But besides him not bringing the food back to these kids that he didn't know, he could have been anybody. He could have did anything to those kids. But God was definitely watching down on them that day. Now the verdict would come out that the reason their mother was gone for so long, she ended up going to one of her buddies' house, indulging in some type of illegal activity, and ended up being locked up for 3 days. So needless to say, they ended up going back to the project soon after the move. As smart as Peaches' mother was, her negative habits clouded her positive intentions, unable to hold down a job or keep a car for a long period of time. And even though Peaches didn't understand life as her mother did, she understood resilience, never giving up, and her mom displayed that through and through. It's the year 1989, and like her older sister, she adapts to her environment quickly. You kind of had to. Her biological father was absent from birth, but she also knew exactly who he was. Her mother would allow her to stay with her father and her 3 other siblings for a time. It proved to be very hard to get to know your own dad, who's been gone your whole life, while watching him cater to 3 kids you've never met. So that dynamic grew to be anything but close or fruitful. Now she was obviously closer with her older sister and her dad, Cadillac. So Nikki took more of a motherly role for her responsibilities around the house, getting to school or bed on time and making sure that she eats throughout the day. But this is what made having such a huge family financially stressful and helpful. So grandma's house was not only a second home, but a safe haven. The same for their cousins, uncles, aunts, family, friends. Call it the neighborhood chill spot.
Everybody hung out there. Not only did my grandmother sell weed, she sold food. Sometimes she babysitted. It's a bunch of girls there. We got cousins. My grandmother was like a mentor, a counselor, a little bit of everything. She was that cool, old school person in the hood. Everybody flocked to that house, and not just for the girls, for her too.
Months and months go by. Peaches and her siblings are back and forth from grandma's house to their own home, and this would be another day with grandma. As Peaches and Ron played around the house, Nikki talking with her father, their uncle Bruh walks through the front door, tired and drunk as can be, and there was Nikki's father, Cadillac, starting to pick with him, pulling on the brim of his hat, high-siding like any other day. And Uncle Bro wasn't in the mood for playing in jokes at the moment, telling him to leave him alone, leave him be. Uncle Bro would end up taking out his gun, a silver revolver, not to harm or kill, but just to brandish. Mind you, Uncle Bro is still drunk as hell. Now Nikki, she knew this could go left at any moment, but just as quick as she tried to get Peaches and run and go outside away from the drama, a shot goes off accidentally.
We was over my grandmother's house at this time, and as soon as I told Peaches, like, let's get up and go outside and play, the gun went off. Pow! All hell broke loose,
striking Peaches in the leg before she can actually reach the front door. When he noticed what he did, he couldn't stop crying, not meaning to hurt little Peaches. So another uncle there at the time, Uncle Booby, picks her up and rushes her to the hospital. And luckily the bullet was through and through and hit no main arteries. Nikki would visit her sister the next day, surprised at how good she was handling it. Even at the age of 9 years old, Peaches was tough as nails. And the way she grew up played a big part in that fact. When it was finally time for her to leave the hospital, she left with her leg inside a cast from the bottom of her foot up to her waist, wrapping around her hips. Imagine a 9-year-old girl having to move around with a granny walker. But like we know, Peaches made the best out of it.
It was a through and through shot, if I'm not mistaken, but it shattered her leg. And I remember going to the hospital and seeing her, and she was okay, but her body was so little. She was only 4'9" as an adult. I'm 4'11". So she was shorter than me. You know, she was just always fighting. You know, it was like some form of black cloud or some sort of demon. I don't know.
So far, you could say Peaches seen and experienced things at this point that most parents today coddle their children from. So the mid to late 80s, it was a gift to anyone who played inside the game. And they wouldn't see the curse of it all until they saw one of two of those revolving doors, which was prison or death. But for the people who just wanted to survive, there was no reward. It was only a curse for those people who just wanted to live a happy and normal life. And Peaches seen it all.
We came up through that crack era and that epidemic, and we seen it.
The drug's so powerful, it will empty the money from your pocket.
And if you had enough heart, respect, power to go get it, there's $1 to be made anywhere in the country. And nobody embodied this fact more than the Flannery brothers, better known today as Big Meech and Southwest T. Two dope boys native to the neighboring state, Detroit, Michigan. They would make their rounds through Cleveland as another hot spot for distribution, which wasn't surprising, knowing that their father Charles Flannery was originally from Cleveland himself.
We seen it, like them the Detroit niggas would come up here to Cleveland and they was hustling, serving. It was like a bloodbath down there in those projects.
Rumors would fly by, and with no one knowing who these guys were, they called them the Detroit Boys. So Peaches and her siblings, being kids at the time, didn't know that these guys walking through their projects will someday build the biggest black American drug organization in the country.
Nobody, I never do this again, because this many niggas and this much money can't get along.
So as years come and go, it gets to a point of no return for Peaches' older sister, and she decided to move out at the age of 13, going back and forth from either her grandmother Miss P on her mother's side or her grandmother on her dad's side, until she decided to fully settle in with Miss P. It became overwhelming dealing with her mother's behavior day in and day out.
I had been living with my grandmother since I was 13. I left home. My mother was drinking, getting high. She wasn't a bad mother, but when my mother got alcohol in her system, and still to this day, she gets angry. So when I was in the 8th grade, I got sick of that shit. I walked to the projects to my grandmother's house. I haven't lived with my mother since I was 13 years old.
Reluctant to leave her sister Peaches behind, but she knew she would keep a watchful eye over her, especially being only blocks away. Over the years, Peaches would go back and forth from moms to Miss P, because as always, she wanted to follow behind Big Sis, but still attached to that bond she shared with their mother. During this time, they still attended the same school, and little 10-year-old Peaches would have her first run-in with a bully. There were some older girls from down the block who would try picking with the Perry sisters, but didn't know the rude awakening they had coming in their near future. Peaches, on her way home from school this day, encountered the young sister of the group, Nookie, who tried her the same way she did every other day. But Peaches did everything but back down. She welcomed any trouble that would come her way, and after easily beating this bully down, she wasn't finished. Grabbing Nookie by the arm, she bent her hand back until fully breaking the girl's hand. Because there was too much evidence of this would-be bully igniting the fire between the two, no repercussions came Peach's way. So you can imagine having your enemy walking around with one of their limbs in a cast, and it quickly stopped all the other classmates from repeating Nookie's mistake.
That beast started coming out of her with fighting. But see, that's what you get for trying to bully some other body. It was from that point on, I knew my sister was a dog with the hand.
She started showing a side of herself unknown to most people, but not Nikki, who caught glimpses of a mean streak here and there, but nothing concrete to be concerned about her. Now it's going on 3 years since her big sister has been living with her grandmother, Miss P. And well into the early 90s, Miss P made it official and gained full custody of her daughter's children. They considered Miss P one of those cool grandmothers, gave them free reign to do way more than they ever could with their mom. They now had access to a phone, a television, people that they can play with. So this transition would work out better than they could ever imagine. The millennial generation gave birth to a new kind of grandmothers, with more of us having babies at very young ages, and Miss P would only be 31 by the time she earned that title herself. So by the time Peaches moved in, fully under her care, her 47-year-old grandmother knew how to show you a good time. But just as her mother Russie didn't spare no rod, Miss P didn't either.
When my Aunt Darlene had came back around, she would sneak in the middle of the night and drink up juice and eat food, and nobody could figure out why. So my grandmother put some pee in the juice container, and when Darlene drank it, everybody told her what happened, and they laughing at her and shit. She never ate the food up and drank the juice in the middle of the night again, and it's pretty f***ed up when you think about it, but that's the type of that my grandmother would do. And back then, you can beat the out of your kids with a switch, a belt, whatever. It wasn't no call child services because it wasn't as easy accessible as it is now. They wouldn't come as quick.
Now, not long down the line, their great-grandmother, which is Miss P's mother, was diagnosed with brain cancer. So they would all move up off the long main strip of St. Clair in the South Collinwood neighborhood. See, most folk outside Cleveland, like myself, always thought of St. Clair as just a hood or one area of the city, but it's actually one long main road intersecting through several neighborhoods. They now permanently moved into their great-grandmother's house to take care of her, and Peaches is now creeping up into her teenage years, 12 going on 13, meeting herself for the second time, you can say. So as everybody settled into their new living arrangements, more family members would also move in with them. Pumpkin and Kendra, with all the kids being around the same ages with the exception of Ron. They all hung tough together, but Peaches, she took more of a liking to Pumpkin. That was her road dog, so to speak, being a big influence in Peaches' life. To give you a better understanding, Pumpkin, she was one of those kids in the neighborhood who was always into something, always doing something, fighting, stealing, cursing, you know, pretty much the definition of a problem child. The same as a lot of us growing up. Actually reminds me a lot of myself. And Peaches, she would end up taking on this persona as the years would go on. But for now, she just breaking off the mold, being that innocent little girl, aside from the minor anger issues, which you could say her upbringing played the bigger part in.
Continuing our teen coverage right now, that double murder, and for others this weekend, many are asking the question,
Are the streets of Cleveland safe?
She didn't start really cutting up until she got in middle school, because that's when we moved up St. Clair to my great-grandmother's house to take care of her. But once she got up there with Pumpkin, it took off from there. You cutting school now and you getting your virginity taken, but this is the beginning, her really rebelling.